Having laid the groundwork, it's now time for some application. Let's have a look at 3 examples of allegedly problematic biblical anachronisms, one from each of the categories we mentioned in Part 1. A good example of an intentional anachronism is found in 1 Chronicles, which refers to a unit of currency called the derrick. The chronicler describes King David as collecting 10,000 derricks for the construction of the temple in Jerusalem. Critics note that the derrick was named after King Darius of Persia, who lived over 500 years after David. This is obviously no more in error than it would be for the secular examples we mentioned in Part 2. The derrick would have been known to the writer of Chronicles in his time. All he did was convert the currency. Probably the best known example of this one can be found in Genesis 14:14. The reference to the city of Dan appears to be a geographical updating by a later scribe. The city named Dan didn't come to have that name until the time of Judges, having originally had a different name. The switch in name was a known factor that later editors and copyists of Genesis would need to deal with. One of my favorite examples of this relates to Genesis 26:1, as well as other passages. In several verses throughout the Old Testament, it is charged that references to the Philistines are anachronistic. The typical charge is that these references occur several hundred years before the Philistines were in Palestine. Now notice first of all that the Philistines were Israel's traditional enemies, well known in the time when critics think that Genesis, Exodus, and Joshua were written. Yet in Genesis, they are depicted as friendly to Israel's founding patriarch. The Jewish scholar Nahum Sarna, in his commentary on Genesis, makes a pertinent observation in this regard. This in turn leads to a second point. If this is somehow an anachronism, then it is a very strange one. There are huge differences between the Philistines of Genesis and those from Judges and beyond. The Philistines in Judges and beyond are bellicose and hostile. The Philistines in Genesis are mild and friendly. In modern terms, it's the difference between... these guys. In addition, the Philistines in Judges and beyond live in a 5-city confederation under lords. The Philistines in Genesis are in one city, which is not one of the 5 from later, and they live under a king. In other words, it appears that the name Philistines is the only thing that was erroneously transported back in time. The rest of what we read is nothing like the Philistines that the alleged creator of the error would have known. If he was mistaken on this account and anachronizing, why don't the Genesis Philistines have lords and reflect the nastiness of the Philistines in Judges? There's more than one answer offered for this matter, but the one I favor is that the Philistines in Genesis were members of an early and lesser wave of settlers from the same area that produced who would later be the Philistines, that is, the Aegean Sea. And there are a few lines of evidence that support this. In the end, it is presumptive to assume our own modern anthropological classification schemes upon people who lived 3,000 years before us. And more broadly, the same thing can be said regarding accusations of anachronism. Such accusations derive from our limited and narrow view through a window of time, not from sure or comprehensive knowledge.